Well, what the Americans are saying in the Stamp Act resolves is that a tax, such as the Stamp Act, is actually what? What it is the government is acquiring some of our property. They're taking money, that's taking property. Property are our rights. Property is one of the most important of the three: life, liberty, or property. Property is right up there at the top. And the government's job is to protect our property, not take it away from us. So in fact, the government cannot take taxes from us. What they're saying is the only way that the government can get money is that people have to give it to the government. It has to be something that the people decide. We know that the government provides us with services, it provides us with legal protections, it does all these things. The government needs money. We recognize that. We want the government to provide us with these services, and the Navy and whatever. And so we are willing to give money to the government. But it has to be by the consent of the governed. Governments can't just take money. People have to consent to give it to the government. And they don't have to do it in person. They don't have to do it, each person literally acting by himself. As a practical matter, they can do it through their representatives. And that's the way government works. People choose representatives to act for them, and then the representatives decide, as representatives of the people who've elected us, we will give this money to the government. That's what a tax has to be. And that's why the Americans came up with the famous slogan, no taxation without representation. And what they meant then was that only their representatives could tax them. And who are their representatives? Well, their representatives are the members of their assemblies, because they elect the members of their assemblies. And that's important. In order to be a representative, you have to be elected by the people you're representing. And so the assemblies qualify. And forever, assemblies had taxed people. And that was legitimate. That was okay, because that's the way it's supposed to work. You can be taxed by your representatives. But Parliament is not elected by people in America. So Parliament could not tax the Americans. And that's the issue. Taxation by Parliament was taking your property. It's violating your natural rights. Parliament could tax people in England because people in England got to elect their members of Parliament. And so that's fine. That's the way it's supposed to work. It's sort of like Parliament is the assembly for England. It's elected by the people of England. It taxes the people of England. That's fine. Each assembly, each colony has its own assembly. Each assembly taxes the people in that colony. That's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way it had always worked. And now Parliament is trying to change that and do something that is a violation of our rights. And you could see this too as an infringement on one of the most important American definitions of liberty. The fact that people in America got to elect their assemblies. And the assemblies are the keys, as it were, to our freedom. That's why we're free. We have assemblies. We elect our own representatives, and only our representatives can govern us. That's a key part of our freedom. And so Parliament was trying to take away our freedom. I mean, this is real basic. That's why Americans would not accept the Stamp Act. That's why the mobs were out wandering the streets, throwing tar and feather on the poor suckers whose job it was to enforce the Stamp Act laws. So Americans adopted these resolves. the members of assemblies meeting in the Congress, they sent the resolves off to England, but interestingly, they sent it to the King of England. And they said, Your Majesty, we are your loyal subjects in America. Because they're still the British subjects. And as such, they accept the king as their sovereign. And they say, Your Majesty, we know you're our royal leader. We love you as the person of the head of our empire. We think we're so lucky to have you as the king instead of those poor Slavs in France and Spain who have kings that demand royal absolutism. And we know that you, as a benighted monarch, will protect our rights. That's your job. You're going to protect our rights. Here's a chance. You need to protect us against Parliament. Parliament is trying to take away our rights. We ask you to use your influence to try to convince Parliament they have to drop these measures because they're violating our rights. They're taking away our liberty. Well, I don't know if people really meant that or not. I don't know if they believed that somehow Parliament was going to be subjected to the king and have the king tell them they can't tax. Americans have this feeling that somehow it's Parliament that's doing everything and the king doesn't know anything and the king is going to take care of us because he's our beloved monarch. The fact was that the King of Parliament was working closely with Parliament in the development of policy. The proclamation had been a royal proclamation. It was issued by the king. The king was working collectively with Parliament. The two of them were working together. The king knows he can't govern over Parliament. Parliament has control of the money, but the king is working closely with Parliament in developing policy towards how to run the colonies. So the king was very much a part of the decision to have the Stamp Act. So Americans, whether they really believe it or not, they've convinced themselves that somehow the king doesn't know and he will take care of us. So they address the Stamp Act resolves to the king. So the resolves get to England, and of course they're sent to Parliament, and the leaders of Parliament thought, wait a minute, what are those Americans talking about? We don't get it. What do you mean, no taxation without representation? We, Parliament, are your representatives. And what's happening here is that there's a question about the definition of the word representative. Much of the whole history of the American Revolution is going to come down to a debate over word definition. When the Americans said representative, they meant somebody who was actually elected by the people that they are represented. England understood representation to mean something different. Today, political scientists have sort of thought about this question of definition and have developed sort of two types of representation. Today, modern political scientists say that the Americans meant what we call actual representation. Actual representation. That is, the people elect their representatives. What Parliament understood by the word representation is what today political scientists call virtual representation. Virtual. That doesn't require that you actually have to vote for the people. People act as your representatives. They act on your behalf. You don't actually have to vote for them. They just are there and they act for you. They do stuff on your behalf. They do things to help you, but they decide what to do. And this definition difference kind of makes sense if you understand that in America, very large numbers of people could vote. Everybody who owned property, at least 50 acres, could vote, and that includes adult white males who comprised, I always use the number, 75% of the population. In England, it wouldn't make sense to have that because so few people could vote anyway. So Parliament's not elected by the people of England. very few people in England actually could vote. So it makes a lot more sense to consider representation as virtual representation. And people don't vote there anyway. So Parliament said, we're your representatives. And the whole point here is that, yeah, only representatives can tax, but that meant Parliament. And for Parliament, the big issue, and this had been a big, long issue in England that I'd talked about before, meant that the king could not tax. Only representatives, meaning Parliament. Only Parliament could tax. And so they're not concerned about voting, they're concerned about that we're Parliament, we're chosen by this very elite group of the English people, and then we are the representatives, so we can tax. So they just couldn't figure out what the Americans were saying. What the America said to them meant no sense. Because, what are you talking about? No taxation without representation. Right, we agree. That means Parliament. We can tax. Well, while this was going on, meanwhile in America, the violence is continuing. The boycott, which was never complete, but was having some impact, was hurting some English merchants. So some English merchants are using their political influence with Parliament to try to convince it to change their ways. And the situation in collecting the tax was so impossible that in fact no tax was ever collected. Not a penny was ever paid to England as a result of the Stamp Act. The poor guys whose job it is to collect the tax could do their job. I mean, they're being beaten up if they try by mobs of Americans. So after a few months, in March of 1766, Parliament said, you know what, this is not working. So they repealed the Stamp Act. So the Americans accomplished their goal. Between the violence and the boycott and the legal protests of the resolves, they convinced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. But Parliament, on the same day that they repealed the Stamp Act, passed another law called the Declaratory Act. It's a declaration. It's just a statement. It doesn't actually have any impact. It's just passing something to say something. And they wanted to make sure that they were repealing the Stamp Act, but that didn't mean they were agreeing with the Americans. They are not going to accept the idea that Parliament cannot tax. So the Declaratory Act declared that Parliament was supreme in the British Empire. I gave you before the expression parliamentary supremacy, and they're asserting it here. Parliament is the supreme governing body of the British Empire, and it has all power to pass any law it wants. The Americans have been saying, you can regulate our trade. I mean, Parliament has been regulating American trade since 1660 with all of the navigation acts that we talked about and the trade regulations and so forth, and all the mercantilist laws. That's been a part of the English Empire forever. And Americans say, yeah, they can pass that, they just can't tax. Well, Parliament say, wait, a law is a law. We can pass any law we want. We can pass a law to regulate your trade. We can pass laws to tax you. We have the right to tax you. And Americans had also been saying, Parliament can tax people in England, but not in the Americas. But Parliament says, no, we can tax all British subjects. We are the supreme governing body of the British Empire, and all British subjects, whether you live in England, or in Ireland, or in the West Indies, or in North America, or in Canada, which has become a British colony, all British subjects are subject to the acts of Parliament. So we are the supreme body. And they just say it. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a statement. It's a declaration, the Declaratory Act. So then the Stamp Act goes off the books. And the mobs go home, and the boycott is called off, and everybody's happy. But the poor British government still needs money. Now they got to figure figure out how to get some money. And the guy in England who was responsible for that is now the Chancellor of Exchequer. And so he comes up with some, he looks at himself and he says, why did the Americans object so strenuously to the Stamp Act? I mean, there were riots and violence, everything. But the Sugar Act, which was the sort of the first law to tax the Americans, ironically, didn't get any kind of protest. So I met with some Americans who were in London. One of them is a name you know, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was in London as a sort of as a lobbyist on behalf of several of the assemblies. He was there for his own assembly of Pennsylvania, but he was also on the payroll of the other assemblies to sort of lobby with Parliament and try to get legislation that would be favorable to the Americans. And so he came up with the idea that these were two different types of taxes. The Stamp Act, well, let me do the Sugar Act first. The Sugar Act was what he called an external tax, and what economists today would call an indirect tax. The money is not actually paid by the consumer to the government. The people who pay the money to the government are merchants. The people who import the sugar and other products, they pay the government to import the sugar. When the boat comes in from the West Indies and it unloads a load of sugar at a harbor in America, the merchant who's doing it pays a tax. Now, presumably, he would add that to the price of the sugar. And so the consumers would eventually pay more, but maybe yes, maybe no. How much he raises the price, doesn't know. It's not actually a direct tax. It doesn't actually tax the people themselves. It's only the merchants who do it, and then from there it's up to them. Normally they will add the tax to the price, but that's their decision. So it's an indirect tax, or what Franklin called an external tax. It's a tax that comes from outside. It's not something in the colony itself. The Stamp Act, by contrast, was a direct tax. It's actually paid by the people themselves. So Franklin called that an internal tax. And this, he said or suggested, that this explains why there was such a great protest against the Stamp Act and very little against the Sugar Act. So people in England said, okay, we get it. Americans will pay indirect taxes or external taxes, or what we would call tariffs, which is what the Sugar Act was. It's just that they will not pay the Stamp Act. So out of this came some new laws to provide revenue to pay the soldiers, and we'll talk about those after we have to take a break here.